This is the Arctic, an icy, cold, beautiful wilderness that is almost completely devoid of people, but crucial for the human race. Our energy reserves elsewhere on the planet are in the process of being depleted, but the Arctic still contains vast quantities of untapped oil and gas. The potential for conflict over these resources has resulted in a substantial increase in military activities in the Arctic during the last few years. Will we manage to resolve any future energy crises without resorting to the use of military force?
Forward to engine. Finish.
Modern civilization is completely dependent on oil, which, more than any other natural resources, defines our current era. The problem is that there will soon no longer be any oil left on Earth. Most of the world's large oil fields have now reached peak oil. This has resulted in oil exploration activities taking place in increasingly more remote places. There is just one source of oil that is still more or less intact. The Arctic, a sea and land massif covering 6% of the Earth's surface. Global warming and new technology are now paving the way for new transport routes and creating access to these resources. We will all be affected by the battle for these resources. For several years, there's been little military activity in the Arctic, but now all the countries in the area are starting to increase their military activity dramatically. Here, on the island of Andøya, is one of the air bases that supports military operations in the Arctic. Someone who is witness to military developments in the Arctic on a daily basis is Johan Hetta, a pilot with 333 Squadron.
333-skvadronen sin hovedoppgave er å drive overvåking og følge med i norske interesseområder, særlig da nordpå. Vi er et instrument for det militære og for staten for å skaffe informasjon og til enhver tid ha et riktig bilde av det som måtte foregå i våre interesseområder.
From their base on Andøya, intelligence-gathering aircraft belonging to the squadron fly to some of the most inhospitable areas in the Arctic. However, Johan Hetta is not unfamiliar with Arctic territory.
Jeg vokste opp i en veldig liten samebygd hvor det bare bodde 350 mennesker. Midt på tundraen på Finnmarksvidda, og far min han har hatt helt siden jeg var liten en Cessna 206 på flottører. Da ble jeg bitt. Med meg så var det aldri sånn at jeg skulle bli politimann, og så skulle jeg bli brandmann, og så skulle jeg bli pilot, og så politimann igjen, eller noe sånt. Jeg har alltid vært, skal alltid bli pilot da. Så det har aldri vært noe skifte sånn sett. Det er utrolig gøy å fly fremdeles, det er det jo. Og helt til å begynne med så var det jo, bare det å komme seg opp var jo ufattelig morsomt. Og det slår fremdeles en dag på kontoret når som helst.
The Orion aircraft is setting course for the Barents Sea in order to carry out a military mission that many people thought would be unnecessary once the Cold War had come to an end. When the Berlin Wall fell, most people thought that the possibility of war breaking out in Europe was something that we'd put behind us. But the Cold War never really came to an end in the Arctic, where the superpowers have been playing intelligence games all along, testing out each other's first strike capabilities. This game is taking place around the polar ice cap, both above and below sea level. This area also contains vast fisheries and petroleum resources that will become even more important in the future, and these nations are using military power to enforce their rights.
Arctic states are looking at a change from global warming. They're seeing where, according to the U.S. Geological Survey, potentially a quarter of the world's oil and gas resources may be under the Arctic cap. And with that comes, as you know, appropriately, a great race, a great game to see who can have access to those resources first.
Both throughout history and in more recent times, the Arctic has had an important military role, even in respect of conflicts taking place on the other side of the world. The Svalsat satellite station is located just outside Longyearbyen on Svalbard. It's eminently suitable for downloading satellite data because the distance between the Earth's satellites and the Earth is shorter here than anywhere else in the world. On the 24th of March 2003, when the US armed forces were heading towards Baghdad, they were stopped by a heavy sandstorm. There were two satellites circling high up in the Earth's upper atmosphere that were able to see right through the sandstorm. In order for these satellites to send their information to the Americans, they were completely dependent on being able to download their observations to a station in the Arctic. And this is where they were sent. The attack on Baghdad was able to proceed. War strategists have been totally dependent on the Arctic ever since the Second World War, because stations based in the Arctic have been able to provide forecasts about the weather in Europe 72 hours in advance. The Second World War was an entirely new type of war during which the Air Force played a crucial role. Precise weather forecasts were essential for the planning of air operations. Both the Germans and the Allies set up secret weather stations in the most inhospitable and inaccessible places they could find. One of these stations, Houdingen, was located on the northern coast of the island of Noord-Oostlanden on Svalbard. It was so inaccessible and remote that it didn't surrender to the Allies until the 4th of September 1945. The Iron Curtain came down almost immediately after the surrender of the soldiers at Houdingen. During the course of just a couple of years, the fronts between the Western powers and Stalin's Soviet Union froze over, especially the Arctic.
The Arctic really was a key area in the Cold War, and it could have become dreadfully chaotic if the war had heated up. During the Cold War, the Arctic, of course, is where conflicting missiles and aircraft would have flown. And therefore, the whole northern rim of Canada was lined with radar stations looking for Russian aircraft. Very big radars were in Scotland and Thule, Greenland, looking for incoming. And I'm sure the Soviets had the same sort of arrangements on the North Shore, that if the balloon had gone up, the Arctic would have been the area over which aircraft would have flown.
One of the many inventions of the Cold War was the Orion intelligence-gathering aircraft, which is still involved in active service. This aircraft is equipped with top-secret listening equipment and is highly efficient at gathering information.
flymaskin bare flyr gjennom luftrommet og tar inn all den informasjonen som blir båret gjennom radiobølger. Vi har radar ombord og andre sensorer som muliggjør å ha et veldig god oversikt over store områder rundt oss. I tillegg til at vi da kan fly veldig langt og forholdsvis fort, i hvert fall i forhold til en båt. På et oppdrag så dekker vi det kystvakta ville brukt 3 uker på.
One of the main tasks is to obtain as much intelligence as possible about increasing Russian activities in the area.
Vi har sett en økning i russisk militær aktivitet generelt. De har vært nede på grunn av dårlig økonomi og begynner å komme nå opp på et normalt nivå. Det har vært unaturlig lite aktivitet de siste 10 årene. Det er jo greit å vite hva naboen gjør, og da dermed forebygge eventuelle konflikter, og at man hele tiden har åpenhet om det man driver med, sånn at man forstår hverandre og ikke har misforståelser.
This increase in military activities could cause suspicion to arise between the countries in the area. In March 2009, Norway organised a major international military exercise, Cold Response. During the Cold War, this was a common event. However, during the last 15 years, the Arctic has fallen increasingly into the shadow of the war on terror. NATO has been focusing elsewhere. For a small country like Norway, which has Russia as its closest neighbour, it's essential to get your allies to become interested in the northern areas again. The Norwegian authorities therefore invited many nations to participate in this exercise.
Det vi prøver å få til nå en økende NATO-overbygning over de øvelsene som foregår. Altså både få flere land inn, få mer profil på dem, men også styrke koblingen til NATOs hovedkvarterer i Europa. Det var jo på mange måter veldig positivt at man i løpet av tidlig 90-tall nedgraderte bekymringene for konflikt i Europa. Det var jo uttrykk for en veldig optimistisk tid, men utviklingen gikk nesten litt vel langt i retning av å fullstendig definere bort det klassiske territoriet til fordel for operasjoner utenfor det klassiske territoriet.
The scenario for exercise Cold Response was an imaginary conflict between 2 states about energy resources. After having been attacked by a larger enemy, the smaller country hits back with the help of its allies. This exercise scenario was not well received by the Russian authorities, who called the exercise a provocation.
Det var noen reaksjoner fra russisk hold på Cold Response. De tar jeg egentlig med ganske stor ro. Vi har en forsvarsallianse, vi ikke flaue over det, vi øver på forsvar. Men det altså en feillesning av det scenariet, at det var et scenarie som sådan involverte Russland i en ressurskonflikt. Dette var et generisk scenario som vi hadde laget for å lage en reell øvelsesbakgrunn som var mest mulig realistisk, men som kunne vært plassert mange forskjellige steder i verden.
The Russians are reacting suspiciously to Western military activities in the Arctic. The explanation for this is largely based on past events.
President Putin in 2005 said that the demise of the Soviet Union was the greatest catastrophe of the 20th century. I think that it's not only President Putin who thinks like this, but the society has also experienced the changes after the Cold War as a great failure. I think that the steps taken by the United States and NATO, other Western European countries and organizations have overlooked how deep the feeling of failure and humiliation can actually be in Russia.
Russia has increased its military activities in the Arctic. This illustration shows sorties undertaken by Russian military aircraft off the Norwegian coast in 2005. 2 years later, these activities had increased dramatically.
The increased military activity, Russia's focus on military power, they have also a domestic dimension. The Russian public react very positively to this kind of activities, which restore the picture of Russia as a great power again.
Russia's revenue from its increasing exports of petroleum and other raw materials has enabled the country to recover after the Soviet Union collapsed at the beginning of the 1990s when it lost the Cold War. Another major nation emerged victorious from this conflict. Thomas Reed was President Reagan's national security advisor at the beginning of the 1980s.
The Cold War really was a conflict between two views as the role of man, government, perhaps supreme beings. It was a free society believing in individual freedoms versus a society that the individual owes his allegiance to the state and exists for the existence of the state. That led to conflicts and could have led to very serious conflicts with possible World War III. It did not, because careful people were involved.
The Cold War resulted in an unprecedented increase in military activities in the Arctic.
This is the story of Camp Century, the city under ice.
Here on Greenland, the USA built what was one of the Cold War's most secret projects, a launch pad for nuclear missiles beneath the ice. A maze of tunnels designed to be several hundred kilometers long and covering an area the size of Greece.
As part of man's continuing efforts to master the secrets of survival in the Arctic, the United States Army has established an unprecedented nuclear-powered Arctic Research Center.
Around 60 trains, each with 10 nuclear missiles ready to be launched, would travel along railway lines in the tunnels. This huge facility was to be powered by nuclear reactors which would also be placed beneath the ice. The secret base was operational between 1959 and 1966. It proved that it was possible for a large number of people to live under such extreme conditions and operate advanced military equipment.
We had to show that we could operate in the Arctic, above the Arctic Circle. This forced the Soviets to keep a number of forces tied down to combat that particular threat. If we hadn't, their forces would have been free to go out into the Atlantic and raise havoc with our sea lines of communication.
At the beginning of the 1980s, the Soviet Navy had modernized the vessels in its northern fleet, and they'd also developed nuclear submarines that were able to hide beneath the polar ice cap. Admiral Ace Lyons decided to counter these developments with a new, aggressive American naval strategy in the Arctic.
We were not going to cede control of either the North Atlantic or the Arctic to the Soviets. The fact that we were able to demonstrate that we could strike the Soviet homeland from the North Atlantic, from the Arctic, tied down a number of their forces, and which to me was a key element in raising the level of deterrence, which is what we were really all about. We were able to do that basically without firing a shot.
All stations TA, we have a possible submarine contact. Bearing 294, 3,500 yards ahead. But you're bogey 8015, take with missiles, cover with guns.
Soviet submarines were shadowed constantly from the time they left their bases on the Kola Peninsula, and they could be sunk the very minute they opened their nuclear missile launch hatches. Soviet submarine commander Boris Kolyada was a witness to the new American strategy.
Меня возмущало нахождение американских подводных лодок в Баренцевом море. Не просто в Баренцевом море, а конкретно у наших территориальных вод, у наших территориальных вод на выходах из баз. Они встречали подводные лодки, надводные корабли, то есть занимались такой активной разведывательной деятельностью, причем активно наглой разведывательной деятельностью. Ну, скажу так, как это рассчитывать, когда ты выходишь из квартиры на лестницу, а там группа хулиганов уже ждет тебя и не дает тебе даже дойти до магазина, допустим, да? Это так вот, шутя, а фактически это очень напряженно сказывалось на службе офицеров, на службе военно-морского флота.
Ubåtjakt jo det som Orion opprinnelig ble designet for, og det fremdeles en av hovedoppgavene våre. Forskjellen fra det som foregikk under den kalde krigen og det som vi gjør nå jo at før var det jo veldig mye mer militært fokus enn det nå da. Så vi har fremdeles, selvfølgelig har vi militært fokus, vi en militær avdeling, men vi har også veldig mye mer ressursforvaltning og en del miljøaspekter da, som overhodet ikke stod i oppdragsporteføljen vår før da. Når det gjelder fiskeressursene nordpå, så blir jo de sendt over hele verden, og det enorme summer det snakk om da. Det derfor det så attraktivt å jukse.
Fish in the Arctic is a renewable resource which yields billions of dollars each year. Here in Reitan, outside Bodø, is the control center which is able to see all movements in the Arctic. In practice, it's only the armed forces who are responsible for the enforcement of rights and keeping an eye on things in the Arctic. Obviously, one of the reasons for this is because they have the necessary expertise and equipment. But the use of military forces and the huge increase in military activities that's currently taking place is also an expression of the fact that there are vast assets to be guarded.
Ta fiskeriene. Det jo praktisk talt et svømmende oljefond. Dette en strategisk ressurs av stor betydning for Norge, men også av stor betydning for andre land. Det svært viktig å ha god kontroll med fiskeriene, slik at ressursuttaket bærekraftig, og at den økonomien som dette representerer også blir ivaretatt på en skikkelig måte. Det svært viktig arbeid.
The Norwegian and Russian coast guards have also cooperated on the prevention of illegal fishing in the Barents Sea. In 2006, the Russian authorities asked for assistance in arresting a pirate ship, the Castor, which was fishing illegally in the Norwegian protection zone.
Den førte falsk flagg. Den hadde flere falske registreringsnumre ombord, og vi identifiserte at fartøyet hevdet å være registrert i hvert fall 3 forskjellige stater. Og Castor skiftet da identitet, litt avhengig av i hvilke zoner og hvilke områder den opererte.
Her ser vi at han tar flekker av malinga den enda ikke tør etter 6-7 timer ombord.
The captain of the Castor was unwilling to allow the Coast Guard to go on board.
Engine. No more discussion now. For what stop engine? Finish. Calm down. Please stop. Please stop engine.
Andre siden, på styrbordssiden.
Det ble tatt kontroll over fartøyet, og fartøyet ble ført tilbake igjen til russisk økonomisk zone og overrakt til russiske myndigheter. Det har vært flere andre slike saker, men budskapet er egentlig at i Barentshavet så gjennomføres det en rekke operasjoner mot aktører som bedriver illegal aktivitet.
Cooperation between Norway and Russia over the management of fisheries in the Arctic has been successful for several years now. But will it be as easy to cooperate over another valuable resource in the Arctic? A resource which, unlike fish, is not renewable. In 2008, two major crises occurred in Russia's neighboring territories, both of which had an impact on our view of the security situation in the Arctic. The first crisis occurred on the 8th of August 2008 when Russian tanks invaded Georgia. The second crisis, which had a direct impact on Europe, occurred later on during the same year. This time, it was the Russians exerting their power in the energy field. In connection with a conflict with Ukraine, Russia shut down the gas pipeline running via Ukraine to Europe. These pipelines were closed for several weeks. When they were eventually reopened, Western Europe's energy reserves were almost empty. Both the invasion of Georgia and the gas crisis were strong wake-up calls for the rest of the world, which had now witnessed Russia's will to exert power in its neighboring areas.
I have long been worried about Europe's potential dependence on Russian natural gas, and like a lot of people, I was relatively relaxed about this from 1989 through the mid-90s because I thought, you know, buying gas from Russia might not be that different than buying it from Canada or Norway or whatever, just a market. But now that Putin and Medvedev are so committed to using energy as an instrument of national power in order to keep Ukraine from joining NATO, you shut off their gas, for example. That situation is, I think, extremely risky.
Geopolitical issues have always been important in the oil industry. There are a lot of concern about the security of supply from various countries where there are some political or security issues. But if we have a long-term perspective of that, I think we need to be optimistic. Even if there are political changes in these countries will need to develop their oil resources because they are so important for their developments.
Looking to the map of the High North, what place Russia as in the map of the High North? How can you govern the High North without Russia? Or you confront Russia, or you go on with Russia. It is important for the alliance to develop a constructive relationship with Russia, and even more important so in the Arctic, in the High North, where Russia is by far a dominant player under any respect.
But gas assets are a two-edged sword for Russia. They're dependent on selling gas to Europe in order to fund their military rearmament. The Soviet Union was paradoxically in the same situation during the Cold War, and this made them vulnerable. In June 1982, there was an explosion in a gas pipeline transporting Soviet gas from the Siberian oil fields to major customers in Western Europe. This explosion had a huge detrimental impact on the country's economy and contributed towards the collapse of the Soviet Union. The official explanation for the explosion was poor workmanship. It would take more than 20 years before the truth was revealed.
An interesting episode in the Cold War was the discovery of the Soviet penetration of the U.S. technology industries and their intent to steal that technology. It came to a head in 1981 when President Mitterrand of France met with President Reagan at a summit meeting in Montreal, took him aside and said, "We have acquired an agent working within the Soviet technology department of KGB, and we have learned that they are stealing technology and targeting others. And would you be interested?" To which, of course, President Reagan said yes. The Farewell Files was the code name for this agent in Moscow. It was learned what the Soviets were going to steal, and instead of stopping it, the American technological industries were recruited to instead ship bogus stuff. The Soviets had natural gas in Siberia. They wanted to sell it in Germany. They were building a pipeline. They needed computers to run this pipeline. They could buy the mainframe computers, but the software they did not have, and they finally acquired illegally through conduits in Canada, except due to the Farewell lead, we knew who that was. And so when the software was sent to the Soviets via this Canadian cutout, it had what's known as a Trojan horse.
The software had been manipulated by the CIA so that it would cause the gas pipeline to explode at a given time.
I believe the intent was to simply have the pipeline spring 1,000 leaks all over, but it appears that what really happened was the pipeline burst in the middle of Siberia, produced an explosion that was visible from space, produced a lot of confusion to U.S. intelligence analysts, and in fact none of us, like even myself, who was in the White House at the time, learned about this until the Cold War is over and we started sorting through the historical files.
Når vi skal ut på et operativt tokt, så har jo det allerede vært et stort system som har jobbet mange timer før vi kommer på jobb. Og vi helt avhengig av at andre gjør sin jobb for at vi skal komme oss av gårde da.
Today, Johan and his crew are going to fly a long intelligence-gathering mission in the Barents Sea.
Så samles vi alle I flyet og tar en siste brief før vi tar av, hvor vi går gjennom toktet før vi liner opp på rullebanen og kommer oss av gårde for å gjøre jobben.
The aim of the mission is to find Russian submarines in order to map their movements and their identity.
Ja, vi har jo veldig bra oversikt over marinedelen som holder til I de områdene hvor vi opererer. Det jo det som jobben vår å vite. Å kjenne igjen båter både med navn og hvilken type det båt og sånt. Det jo en del av den utdanningen som du har. Jeg har jo veldig respekt for mine russiske kolleger, akkurat som jeg går ut ifra at de har respekt for meg som en profesjonell som gjør min jobb. Så de også profesjonelle I sin jobb, og sånn sett det jo egentlig veldig positivt for oss at de ute og seiler og får den treningen de skal, for hvis det noe de fleste enige om, så det at å ha et en kompetent nabo bedre enn å ha en nabo som dårlig trent og Det er da du kan få ulykker og misforståelser som kan skje. Så at de får den treningen som de selvfølgelig skal ha, det er jo bare positivt for oss.
The area patrolled by the Orion aircraft is changing rapidly. During the last 40 years, the ice around the North Pole has been melting fast. This is now making it possible to extract large quantities of oil and gas. Petroleum reserves elsewhere in the world are being exhausted, so pressure on the Arctic is increasing.
People must keep in mind that producing oil and natural gas in those regions is extremely difficult. Conditions are terribly harsh. In some cases, they're almost impossible. In cases where it's almost impossible, the cost of producing oil or natural gas escalate dramatically. So yes, there is a prize there to be, I hope, gained by a number of countries that have borders around that region, but it won't be simple, and it will not be fast, and it is likely to be politically messy also.
The military race in the Arctic has started, and once more, soldiers from other NATO countries are taking part in exercises in the Norwegian snow.
I think you're seeing an increased operational tempo of NATO's interest because we see an evolving policy towards the high north. Russians have certainly expressed their strong interest, as well as our Canadian colleagues. They are now providing troops, contingents in both, to look at Arctic operations, search and rescue. So again, I think you're looking not just from the U.S. perspective, but NATO and many of our closest allies are taking a strong posture in the high north.
The melting ice is not just resulting in better access to oil and gas. It can also create new and more efficient transport routes. In the future, it may be possible to transport goods along the Canadian coast through the Northwest Passage and along the coast of northern Russia through the Northeast Passage. By using these new routes, the transport time from Asia to Europe could be reduced by almost 40%. But these new transport routes are also causing conflict. They are one of the reasons why Canada, for example, is now increasing its military activities in the Arctic.
The need to assert our sovereignty and to take action to protect our territorial integrity in the Arctic has never been more urgent.
Canadian Prime Minister Stephen Harper is ready and clear on the subject.
You either use it or you lose it. Let me be absolutely clear that your new national government is committed to using it.
Canada is staking its claim to the Northwest Passage as being in Canadian territorial waters. But the USA doesn't agree with its neighbour and thinks that the Northwest Passage is in international waters with unrestricted transport for everyone.
The question of the status of the Northwest Passage is an area where we agree to disagree. But at some point there will have to be some clarification and clarity brought to our disagreement on the status of the Northwest Passage.
On the other side of the North Pole, the melting ice is presenting Russia with a security challenge as its entire northern coastal strip is becoming exposed. The Russian Northern Fleet is now undergoing substantial modernization. One of Russia's military commitments involves the modernization of its nuclear submarines, which are able to fire their missiles from concealed positions beneath the surface of the ocean. This is exactly the type of Russian submarine that Johan and his Orion aircraft crew are hunting for today.
Å holde øye med hvor ubåter er. Det blir ganske viktig når man tenker på at de største ubåtene har over 200 stridshoder som ganske mange ganger større enn en Hiroshima-bombe. Så i praksis kan en ubåt ta ut 200 byer da. Det ikke noe problem.
After several hours in the air, the Orion aircraft has still not managed to detect any Russian submarines. Suddenly, the Orion sensors register something beneath the surface of the sea. The crew shoot out listening buoys to find out what it might be. After a while, it becomes apparent that the aircraft is flying above a Russian Delta-class submarine. It's over 150 meters long and is equipped with long-range missiles. The submarine remains hidden beneath the Barents Sea, but the crew of the Orion have secured important intelligence data and they return to base. History has shown that military activities in the Arctic are a dangerous balancing act. Norway, Canada and Russia are now increasing their military focus in the area. Does this mean that the Cold War is back?
Det en viktig forskjell på hvordan man tenkte militært om Arktis under den kalde krigen og nå, at under den kalde krigen så var jo poenget rent militært. Det var rent fysisk så Arktis den korteste veien mellom daværende Sovjetunionen og USA. Når man har et militært blikk på nordområdene i dag, det jo ikke disse grunnene, men det mer avledet av at det en sivil, kommersiell interesse for nordområdene, altså ressursene, fisken, transportrutene, slik at det helheten av det som skaper et ønske i alle statene om å følge med på det som skjer, bedre etterretning, mer evne til nærvær, både fredstidsnærvær med altså kystvakt, tjenester, søk og redning, overvåkning, men også evnen til å gjøre sine interesser tydelige dersom man skulle få en mer komplisert situasjon.
I hope we can avoid wars. It's not inconceivable that there will be wars. The Arctic has potential, probably significant potential to produce natural gas and useful and significant quantities of oil also. I think we're all well aware of the fact that the areas up there are disputed between countries, and we're going to have to find some way to settle those land disputes. And I hope that's peaceful, by the way, because there have been resource wars in the past, and I would hope that we can avoid those at our stage of development and civilization today.
Nordområdene, sånn som vi kjenner det i dag, et stabilt område som inneholder mange strategiske verdier. Det i veldig stor forskjell til andre områder i verden hvor man finner strategiske verdier og ressurser. Disse veldig ofte karakterisert med uro, ustabilitet og militær konflikt. Den situasjonen har vi ikke i nordområdene. Derfor det maktbeliggende for oss å opptre på en sånn måte at vi ikke får en slik ustabil situasjon i nord.
In order to show that priority is being placed on the northern areas, the Norwegian armed forces are now transferring their operational leadership from southern Norway to northern Norway. They're also organizing international military exercises close to the Russian border.
Russia has great sensitivity to any NATO exercise along its border. We are in a very hypersensitive time where NATO is exercising near the perceived sphere of influence of Russia. It's absolutely understandable, and I think NATO asked Moscow to be an observer to the High North exercises, not a participant, but an observer, and Moscow flatly rejected that offer, and then in kind held exercises very close to Finland. I think you'll see this tit for tat. I think it's, again, they're showing each other their interest. They're showing each other their response to an evolving policy. But again, what's so critical is to maintain dialogue.
There is a range of steps we may take to avoid at least fueling of the suspicious attitudes prevailing on the Russian side. So the military activity, which is of the highest concern to Russia, should be definitely transparent, include Russia to the possible extent, of course, and avoid appearing as provocative.
NATO's military leaders are also keen to resolve the race for resources in the Arctic without resorting to military force.
We don't want to return to the Cold War atmosphere. We want to prevent this to happen. So if we want to prevent this to happen, the best and more useful strategy is to engage in a relationship with Russia to make Russia a responsible co-player of the international community. NATO needs to be careful not to be an element of rising tension. On the contrary, an element of keeping the low tension and even building greater stability.
In order to maintain stability in the Arctic, the nations are continuing to boost their military activities. This is why there's been an increase in the work of those who have been appointed to keep an eye on resources.
Vi får jo bare mer og mer å gjøre, så jeg ser ikke for meg at arbeidsoppgavene våre blir noe mindre i overskuelig fremtid. Etter hvert som militæraktiviteten øker og fiskeriressursene forsvinner jo for så vidt ikke, altså, i hvert fall ikke hvis vi passer på. Så oppgavene blir større hele tiden, og kommer ikke til å forsvinne, ikke mens min karriere pågår i hvert fall, det helt sikkert.
The race to exploit vast natural resources has commenced in one of the world's most important larders. The Earth's most vulnerable ecosystem is under threat from oil spills, dying fish, and global warming. As the ice melts, many people are being tempted to engage in predatory activities in the Arctic, in an ocean where the fish resources have already been used up.
I've decided that effective at midnight tonight, there will be a moratorium on harvesting of northern cod.
He's done nothing but SHIT to us.
Is predatory activity about to restart? In the hunt for valuable resources, we've engaged in the exploitation of the vulnerable territory of the Arctic. Fish stocks are under threat from increasing global consumption and today's efficient fishing methods. This could result in fatal consequences for the environment in the northernmost part of the world. Developments have rapidly enabled us to deplete fish stocks, burn up our last drops of oil, and wipe out the planet's resources simply by pressing a button. For generations, we've been turning to the Arctic seas for our food, a larder that is essential for our existence.
Er det en ting som er helt sikkert, så er det jo at vi trenger mat som er høstet på en bærekraftig måte. Og det er klart at fiskeriressursene i nordområdene her er ekstremt viktig for å forsyne verdens befolkning med denne type mat. Og vil være veldig, veldig alvorlig. Det vil være mange flere mennesker som rett og slett vil sulte hvis ikke vi kan høste av disse ressursene.
Some people have said, you know, with the technology, we could take every fish in the ocean. Now, I'm not quite sure that's true. It's, you know, at least one might get away. But the point is made that we could do this.
Det er klart at vi er i stand til å tømme de arktiske havene for resten av torsken. Vi har tømt det for de gamle storhvalartene, grønlandshval og nordkaper. Vi har ødelagt mange andre fiskebestander. Og vi har ødelagt verdens største torskebestand på the Grand Banks.
Predatory activities directed at Arctic resources could have an impact on us all, something already experienced by coastal fishermen in Newfoundland off the eastern coast of Canada. Bernard Martin has witnessed major changes in the Arctic ecosystem due to his close relationship with marine resources.
I started fishing in the early 1970s, and I've fished pretty much my whole adult lifetime. It's been mostly my only occupation. It's part of my life. It's what defines me as a person. I am a fisherman, and you know, it's very important to me. In the morning, as the sun comes up, it's very special. Yeah, there's not too many jobs like it, I don't think.
Ever since Bernard first started fishing, he's been witnessing predatory activities aimed at cod stocks.
The first thing I learned was that there was a huge threat to the health of our cod fishery.
He's made his mark by becoming involved in a commitment to stop overfishing.
I guess from an environmental conservation perspective, I started to get involved with organizations that were trying to bring some attention to the crisis in the fishery, to overfishing in general, and you know, to habitat destruction and all that. I became even more involved, and I started doing speaking tours.
Through his involvement and meetings with politicians, Bernard has put across his message about the need for moderation in the hunt for resources.
I guess we have to keep it in the backs of our minds that as a species, and we have the technology and the power and the will, whatever it is, to destroy anything on the planet.
It's been maintained in several quarters that we're in the process of depleting fish stocks in the Arctic. Fishing operations are now so efficient due to modern technology that the cod stocks in the Barents Sea could be wiped out.
Man står litt I sånn slør, og da det helt umulig å si, rett og slett. Men det mye.
The captain is looking for the perfect place to deploy his seine net.
Du venter på fløyta går.
If it's deployed in the wrong place, he could risk losing several $1,000s. Is it possible for today's trawlers to threaten what are probably the most important fishing stocks in the world and to empty the sea of fish? This is what happened in the Arctic ecosystem in the sea off Newfoundland. One of our most important sources of food, fish rich in protein, comes from this area.
If you go back to the days of sail and the days of small boats not powered by engines, you have a fishery which depends a lot on the bravery of people, you know, the willingness to go out in difficult weather and the ability to understand the environment, to understand when it's safe and when it's not safe, and when there are going to be fish and when there isn't going to be fish.
These cod stocks were so vast that fishermen from all over Europe made a long journey to these fishing banks in the northwest.
All of the early fishing would have been with a hook and line. Some baited, some not. I mean, cod are so voracious at certain times of year. They're so hungry that you don't even need bait. I mean, all you need is something shiny in the water with a hook. It gives you some idea of the tremendous abundance of the fish that was there. You know, they would have no problem catching that much. Hundreds of thousands of tons, all caught one by one.
After the Second World War, the fishing industry experienced a technological revolution. The heroic courage of fishermen was replaced by equipment designed to improve catch efficiency.
Bringing trawlers here was initially thought to be uneconomical, but all of that changed after the Second World War. Some of the other inventions that came were the botter filleting machine. Freezing is another one of the technologies that came along. When echo sounders came, you can go and find every fish in the ocean. You can find every one. So all of a sudden, you can literally clean out a whole stock, fillet it and freeze it with very little labor relative to what happened before. So what it meant was that instead of you taking all season and all of the communities around Newfoundland to catch 200,000 tons, they eventually, given this technology, could catch 1 million tons in a couple of months. It just completely upped the ante in terms of what was possible.
Using current technology, we could virtually suck up all the species of fish in the sea.
If we are to harvest fish from the ocean sustainably, we have to control ourselves. We cannot have unfettered use of all technology, or we will kill everything in the ocean.
But fish stocks are not just being threatened by efficiency on the conveyor belt. They could also be hit by changes in temperature.
Fra begynnelsen av 1990-tallet så har vi altså hatt eventyrlig god produksjon av Barentshavtorsken på grunn av de høye temperaturene. Og det har fortsatt å øke helt fram til første halvdel av dette tiåret. Og vi må kunne si at Barentshavtorsken i dag er historisk høy.
Many scientists say that the temperature in the Barents Sea will drop during the next few years. How would this affect cod stocks?
Når temperaturen går ned, så reduseres planktonproduktiviteten. Og opprettholder man da et like høyt fiskepress som man hadde under disse gode årene, så blir det for mye for den bestanden.
Due to the fact that cod stocks in the Barents Sea have now climbed to record high levels, quotas for 2009 have been increased by 100,000 tons for 2010. That means an increase of around 20%.
Selv om vi har en høy bestand, så må vi være veldig varsomme med fisketrykket når produktiviteten i planktonet går ned.
If the scientists are right about the temperature in the sea dropping, then cod stocks in the Barents Sea will soon be affected.
Dersom det blir kaldere, så reduseres planktonproduksjonen i Barentshavet omtrent fra det ene året til det andre. Resultatet er ganske omgående reduksjon i eggproduksjonen for den fiskebestanden, og vi får med en gang mye dårligere rekruttering.
Faren er at naturlige endringer og nye miljøpåvirkninger, først og fremst klimaendring, dessuten miljøgiftproblematikken og andre biologiske endringer som skjer i havet, kan føre til en situasjon hvor dagens forvaltningsregime ikke er godt nok til å reagere på endringer som skjer i naturen.
The first people to notice that cod stocks were changing were the coastal fishermen when, more than 20 years ago, they issued warnings about stocks facing a crisis.
People knew that draggers were becoming a bigger and bigger part of the fishery, and that they had this technology and this power to do a lot of damage to the stocks and also to the ocean environment, the bottom environment. So this, it was always this knowledge was in the back of people's minds, and it was kind of scary.
They were affected by their fear of stocks collapsing.
But this is our resource, a resource that made us what we are, that's sustained us for hundreds of years, and now it's threatened by the foreign fleets, the factory freezer trawlers and the big draggers mostly from Europe, from the Soviet Union. When people saw that the stocks were getting smaller and smaller, and the numbers were fewer and fewer, and also the fish was coming inshore later and later in the season, people reacted. I guess it's a typical human reaction. You just try harder.
They were powerless as they tried in vain to change developments.
There was a lot of frustration because we certainly, as a community and also as a province, and all the inshore communities were complaining about what was happening, that the fish were getting scarcer and scarcer, and it seemed that nobody was listening.
A disaster was in the process of occurring.
It was just massive overfishing that started after the Second World War. And after that, things became very unsustainable very, very quickly.
Tragedy was unavoidable. Former Canadian Fisheries Minister John Crosbie was forced to make a very unpopular decision.
There was a constant crisis in the fishery, and it was getting worse and worse. And what finally made it certain that we had to close the cod fishery was the fact that the scientists were reducing their estimates of what a total allowable catch was permissible.
The inshore fishermen were starting to realize this is not working. The cod are not growing the way we expected. We better start to cut back. But by then, it was too late. The machinery was in place, the industry was in place, the politicians were faced with the fact that the science was telling them that far too many fish were being killed, the quotas were far too high, and what were they going to do?
So I certainly can remember that day.
We need to reduce catches to a minimum to protect the dangerously low spawning stock, the lowest level since records began, and allow faster...
I was having a press conference in this hotel, and that day, July 2nd, and so the hotel was full, and it had been full of fishermen in particular all day.
I'm aware of the serious problem.
They had me in one room making the announcement. Others had to go to a second room, another separate room, and watch on television the announcement.
For all of those reasons, and to safeguard the northern cod as a species, I've decided that effective at midnight tonight, there will be a moratorium on harvesting of northern cod.
And this got them very angry.
He should appear before us, the fishermen. I ain't stupid.
Couldn't blame them, the fishermen, but in particular, they were in a bad mood anyway and worried about their future.
We should go down and knock on that door.
And here was this huge thumping sounds right to the fishermen hurling themselves against the door, trying to get into the room.
No. 6 generations down the line passed out, and he's done nothing but shit to us.
After the press conference was over, the police felt I was in danger, and so I had to be escorted out of this hotel with the police on either side of me.
What are you doing? Why get off of me? You're retarded!
That was the end. The summer of 1992 was probably the first summer in 500 years when there was no fishery in coastal Newfoundland. It was like somebody threw a switch.
Busy days at the fishing factory are now a thing of the past. Today they stand as monuments to how human predatory activities aimed at resources can backfire.
The whole basis of sustainable fisheries is to take no more than what that stock can replace each year. And we utterly failed here in our waters to live by that simple rule.
30,000 coastal fishermen lost their jobs, and the world's most abundant cod stocks were almost wiped out.
The inshore fishermen, they were the ones, and the fishing communities in which they lived all around the island were the people who paid the biggest price for this calamity, which really took 40 years to bring about.
There was no income. The fishery was shut down. What are we going to do for a living? How are we going to, pay our bills and feed our families and make our mortgage payments and whatever, right?
18 years after fishing operations were stopped by the authorities, cod stocks have still not recovered enough to reach the sort of levels that would enable coastal fishermen to resume their activities.
It may take another 10, 15, 20 years, who knows, before the stocks are even close to what they were, historically, let's say back in the early 1960s. You can look to Canada as an example of how not to manage your fishery. It's a huge tragedy, and it should never have happened. The island developed because of cod. People settled here because of cod. I think wars were fought over the cod resource.
One war over resources resulted in amendments to the law of the sea. Germany and Britain had long been engaged in fishing activities in the sea off Iceland. In 1958, Iceland declared an expansion of its fisheries zone to an outer limit of 12 nautical miles, despite protests from Britain. However, this was accepted without any major conflicts occurring. But in the 1970s, Iceland extended its claim.
So in the early 1970s, they widened the 12-mile limit to a 50 nautical mile limit. After only 2 years, the Icelanders realized that 50 miles was not enough either. So they widened their economic zone to 200 nautical miles.
A full-scale conflict developed between these two NATO allies.
Can you tell me, have you seen any sign of the Icelandic gunboats, over?
Several incidents involving the Icelandic Navy and British trawlers supported by Royal Naval vessels created discord within NATO. It was only when Iceland threatened to close the US NATO base in Keflavik that Iceland managed to force through its extended economic zone.
I utgangspunktet så jo historien om en økonomisk zone et viktig kapittel I menneskenes historie og forvaltning av havene. Og det at kyststatene har 200 nautiske mil automatisk, og så må de strekke grenser der hvor de overlapper, det har jo lagt et grunnlag for kyststatkontroll med ressursene som helt avgjørende.
But what's happening outside the 200 nautical mile limit?
We have a kind of peculiar situation here on the Grand Banks because it extends, the bank itself extends so far from the shore that a portion of it is outside the 200-mile limit in international waters. We normally call this the nose and the tail of the bank for the northern area and the southern area that are outside.
We spent years in frustration trying to get the North Atlantic Fisheries Organization, which controls the area outside 200-mile economic zone, to take action, and they ignored us and they ignored our protestations.
A large international fleet has continued fishing just outside Canadian territory in the middle of an area inhabited by large quantities of fish that have survived the 1992 collapse in cod stocks. This provoked the Canadian authorities, who decided in 1995 to mark their displeasure by resorting to military force.
It has systematically destroyed stock after stock after stock, and Canada is determined that it will not let this fleet destroy this stock.
The Canadian Coast Guard arrested a Spanish trawler, the Estay, which was outside Canadian jurisdiction. By using water cannon and firing a .50 caliber machine gun, they managed to stop the Estay and escort her to the quay in St. John's.
It's hard to see how things have improved very much in international waters. And this is a world problem and is going to have to be dealt with. In the coming century, this is going to be, I think, one of the major international concerns. Squabbles over resources have always driven many of the political agendas in the world, and this is going to be one for the 21st century.
The Estay case resulted in major demonstrations in Canada and Spain. The European Union subjected Canada to heavy diplomatic pressure because Canada had arrested the Estay in international waters.
Je considère tout ça un acte de piraterie organisée.
The Canadian authorities responded by displaying illegal catch equipment from the Estay at a press conference in New York.
Canada has been the most reluctant of nations to assert its own self-interest. The question now is not why are we doing it today, the question is why has it taken us so long?
Despite EU accusations of piracy, Canada also received support for having drawn attention to fisheries problems in international waters.
I would, the Minister, in fact, make it abundantly clear that we are well aware that Spanish fishermen have illegally destroyed fishing grounds in many other areas, and will stand 100% behind Canada in trying to deal with what is a real problem from which we can't run away.
The Estay was released after being held for 1 week, and her crew were able to return home. But Canada had succeeded in expressing its frustration about European predatory activities on its fishing banks.
EU jo, slik som fiskeripolitikken deres nå, for så vidt en fare for fiskeriressursene. Dette skyldes jo selvfølgelig at EUs fiskeripolitikk fryktelig vanskelig å utforme. Det en kamp mellom utallige, knallharde nasjonale politiske realiteter. For eksempel det ikke lett for spanske myndigheter å ta vekk subsidier fra baskiske fiskere. De fleste vet hvor touchy Baskeland-problematikken I Spania. Og det fører til at spanske politikere mer opptatt av å holde baskerne på matta enn hvordan det går med torsken.
It is rather ironic that, fishermen here since 1992 have been under moratorium. But fisheries are still taking place out there, largely through bycatch, by the way. They're not supposed to be catching cod, but we know from even the statistics that are available is that the bycatch levels are considerable. and they're high enough to prevent that particular stock from ever recovering.
It bothers me certainly that there's all continuing to be reports of overfishing and misreporting and all that outside the 200-mile limit, and I think we still have to keep working at trying to bring some of the other countries into line, and stop some of the overfishing and misreporting that happens apparently outside the 200-mile limit. I have a lot of concerns, to be honest. I do have a lot of concerns about the future because I keep looking for signs that we've changed our ways, that fishery management is different. I mean, we still keep making mistakes.
The hunt for short-term profits tempts many captains into using illegal methods. Pirate fishing is currently one of the greatest threats to fish stocks in northern areas. It appears to be very difficult to stop such fishing activities. On the 15th of October 2005, the Norwegian Coast Guard came across a Russian trawler, the Electron, which they immediately suspected was engaging in illegal fishing activities. 2 Norwegian Coast Guard inspectors were sent on board and found that illegal fishing equipment was being used. When the Coast Guard attempted to make an arrest, the Electron made a run for it.
This is a very serious matter, and I order you immediately to change course.
Я помню, как Советский Союз защищал свои приоритеты и свое право в этом районе. Я помню о том, что какие были границы исторически установившиеся. Поэтому, на основе законодательства я считал, что я прав, а норвежцы не правы. Поэтому я и так принял такое решение.
With the 2 inspectors as hostages, the captain tried to enter Russian waters, hotly pursued by a large Norwegian naval force. After 3 days on the run, the Electron reached Russian waters and the Norwegian Navy was forced to negotiate with the Russian authorities. The Norwegians handed over evidence to the Russian authorities and the Norwegian inspectors were released.
Jeg tror det går an å gjøre mange analyser av elektronsaken. Jeg vet ikke om dette var en slags prøvesten eller en test på hvordan Norge ville reagere fra, skal vi si, enkelte krefter i det russiske systemet. Eller om det rett og slett var en fiskeskipper som det rabla litt for der og da. Det tror jeg ikke vi kommer til å få vite. Saken ble jo løst. Det skal vi være glad for, men jeg tror ikke det er den siste saken hvor grensesetting og testing og reaksjonsmønster blir utprøvd.
Ever since it was first discovered, the Arctic has been exposed to predatory activities. Whales, seals and walruses were much coveted targets for those engaged in whaling and sealing activities.
Ved hvalfangsten på grønlandshval, som europeerne startet nord i Barentshavet på slutten av 1600-tallet, var jo det første store overgrepet mot Arktis natur og ressurser.
Extensive whaling activities were embarked on in the Arctic after explorers returned with descriptions of the abundant life that existed in the seas there. During the course of just a couple of hundred years, these activities resulted in disastrous consequences.
The Spitsbergen stock of the bowhead whales has been calculated to have been between 48,000 individuals. And over the 3 centuries of being exploited by commercial whalers, some 100,000 individuals have been taken.
Bowhead whales were hunted almost to the point of extinction. The oil extracted from these whales was used for lighting purposes in the burgeoning towns of Europe.
Da man I løpet av en 100 års tid hadde utryddet de bestandene, kom jo en stund senere turen til de andre store hvalartene, før nordmennene da satte kursen mot Antarktis og banet vei for det virkelig store hvalblodbadet I Antarktis, som jo mange andre nasjoner raskt ble med på og var en del av.
Many people also consider that predatory activities are occurring on the other side of the world, in the Antarctic. A major drive to stop Norwegian and Japanese whaling activities has resulted in conflict. On the 5th of January 2010, this conflict almost ended up with the loss of human life. A Japanese whaling vessel collided with a boat belonging to the environmental organization Sea Shepherd, indicating that the conflict between conservation interests and market forces is likely to intensify in the future. Today, commercial whaling in the Arctic is a thing of the past, but it has left its mark.
Perspektivet på den fangsten som har vært tidligere, hvis man seiler opp til Svalbard til Amsterdamøya der for eksempel, så det ligger jo på grunn av at permafrosten tar vare på alt av bein, og det liten forråtnelse, det ligger jo så enorme mengder med ben og rester og skjeletter etter den her fangsten. Så det jo I seg selv en tragisk historie med rovdrift, med enkle midler, som virkelig har forandret økologien. Og så vet vi I dag hvor avanserte teknologiske midler som finnes. Altså det ikke lett å være fisk I dag når du ser de ekkoloddene som ombord på fiskebåtene. Så det klart at vi har fått noen voldsomt kraftige redskaper til å kunne drive rovdrift.
A new world is in the process of being revealed in the ice-covered waters of the Arctic. The consequences of global warming are more evident here than anywhere else in the world. What used to be safe territory for polar bears is now starting to melt. The ice could disappear completely in the future, and polar bears would thus be prevented from migrating from their winter lairs to their hunting grounds. Failure to take global warming seriously could have a detrimental effect on this symbolic image of the Arctic.
Isbjørnen har blitt et slags symbol på klimaendringene I nordområdene. Men det jo langt mer dramatiske konsekvenser enn at isbjørnen eventuelt forsvinner, som kommer til å påvirke oss.
The environment isn't just being threatened by the melting ice. The arms race between the major powers has also left its mark.
Ja, det ingen tvil om at det geopolitiske bildet I Arktis, det sikkerhetspolitiske bildet I Arktis, gått fra den kalde krigen sitt perspektiv til et ressurs- og miljøperspektiv. Men vi jo på ingen måte ferdig med den kalde krigen I Arktis.
Stocks of environmental poisons and radioactive waste are lying like undetonated bombs and threatening the world's cleanest seas.
Den kalde krigen har ført til et enormt stort problem når det gjelder radioaktivt avfall. Det gjelder både de store anleggene som ligger ved elvesystemene i Sibir, hvor det blant annet ligger store mengder med vann som er forurenset, og som vi frykter kan flomme ut og renne nordover gjennom elvesystemet og kontaminere og øke radioaktivitetsnivået i Arktis. Det er en belastning vi må ta med oss sammen med de raske temperaturforandringene som reduserer naturens og økologiens bufferkapasitet.
Klimaendringene sender jo to budskap. Det ene er at se, isen smelter. Det fremste varsel på at vi må endre økonomienes utslippskarakter og få utslippene ned. Det er det viktigste. Men budskap to er jo at det åpner seg nye sjøtransportveier. Det kan gå nordvestpassasje, nordøstpassasje eller rett over Nordpolen.
During the summer of 2009, beluga shipping from Germany sailed successfully through the Northeast Passage. This trip indicates that there could be a substantial increase in shipping in the area.
Det er en symbolreise som viser at det er mulig. Og det er en symbolreise for fremtiden. Noe er i ferd med å skje.
But if the Arctic Ocean was open during the summer months, this would considerably reduce the time it would take to transport goods by sea between Europe and Asia. For example, a hypothetical route between the ports of Rotterdam in the Netherlands and Yokohama in Japan would be 40% shorter than the present route through the Suez Canal. This is attracting the interest of the major powers.
For det første så vet vi allerede at det fraktes olje og gass ut fra Nordvest-Russland. Dette er strategiske ressurser som de ønsker transportert til sine egne markeder og til verdensmarkeder. Jeg er ikke noe i tvil om at olje- og gasstransporter kommer til å øke i årene fremover.
Many people are highly critical of such increased activities. An accident in these areas could result in serious consequences for fish stocks and other forms of animal life.
Dette er et sted hvor store pattedyr beiter, isbjørn, hval, og som er grunnlaget for de rike fiskeriene som vi har da i særdeleshet i Barentshavet. Hvis man får et oljespill i et område av denne typen, så ville man kunne redusere grunnlaget for de fiskeriene man har der på en dramatisk måte.
Basically, what's happening now outside OPEC is that the decline of traditional crude oil, like in the North Sea or in Mexico, in Russia, production is declining, and in some cases very, very steeply. And we see oil companies developing new resources like tar sands in Canada, like heavy crudes, deep oil resources in Brazil. And Arctic oil is certainly a new area of research that is quite fascinating because it's one of the rare areas in the world that has never been drilled so far. Because it was technically speaking too difficult to have access to these resources, and it's becoming now something that looks possible. But of course there are many problems to be solved before having access to these resources.
Utviklingen og utnyttelsen av ressursene, den skal være så begrenset at om det skulle skje en ulykke, så vil den ha begrenset lokal betydning. Men hvis man ser dette i lys av de signalene stormaktene kommer med for det arktiske området, så er det helt åpenbart, slik jeg ser det og fortolker det, at stormaktene vil ha disse ressursene I de kvanta de trenger, og de trenger store kvanta.
There's currently an escalation in the conflict between the environment and oil production in the Arctic.
Vi tror jo at Arktis har et stort potensial, men det må da avdekkes nå gjennom industriell virksomhet og letevirksomhet I de områdene, både I Alaska, utenfor Grønland, I Barentshavet, I Norge på russisk side, og selvfølgelig også videre østover.
Vi vet at hele dette området her har noe av verdens reneste mat I dag. Høy kvalitet, godt betalt, kan fø mange mennesker. Det klart, dette kan vi ikke sjanse på. Faren for en oljeulykke, den kan man alltid diskutere matematisk hvor stor den men ingen kan bestride av at vi ikke har teknologi, utstyr eller kompetanse til å rydde opp eller avklare de effektene I disse kalde og brutale områdene.
Spøkelsesskipet som ligger nesten helt under vann, klistret opp til klippene på sørspissen av Shetland, strekker seg nå 60 kilometer nordover langs kysten av Shetland.
Vi har sett hvordan disse skipene kan havarere. Det faktum at så mange aktører flytter inn I dette området. Det inviteres sågar til sektorkonflikter. Og vi har sett det nå I Lofoten, Vesterålen, hvor det lovende strukturer for olje og gass I områder som oppvekstområder for fisk. Og vi ser hvordan fiskerinæringen og miljøinteressene på den ene siden står mot olje- og gassindustrien.
The cod in the Barents Sea are completely dependent on Lofoten and Vesterålen where they spawn. The same applies to herring, which is one of the most important sources of food for cod. Roe and larvae float with the current into the Barents Sea, where they grow and form the basis of one of the world's most abundant fisheries.
Og hvis du tar vekten av de eggene, som ligger altså I en meters tykkelse på bånd hver vår, så veier de 7 ganger mer enn Norges befolkning på 4,5 millioner mennesker. Så det en stor biologisk masse. Dette jo et av de 5 viktigste områdene for marin fiskeproduksjon I verden. Den type oljesøl akkurat I drivbanen til Sildingen, som veldig sårbar for den type forurensning, og som en så viktig del av næringsgrunnlaget for torsken videre, kan få dramatiske konsekvenser.
Det viktig for oss, skal vi opprettholde aktiviteten på norsk sokkel, fortsette teknologiutviklingen og kompetanseutviklingen I norsk olje- og gassnæring, så det viktig at vi får tilgang til nye områder, og dette det mest interessante for oss.
Det å ta vare på torsken versus å ikke ta vare på den, på en måte skillekriteriet på om vi slår inn på riktig vei, eller om vi fortsetter på gal vei.
Advanced trawlers, global oil companies, and giant supertankers are all heading north. The race has started in earnest. Predatory activities of the past have created a lasting impression. Our knowledge is better this time, but will we look after this vulnerable area, or will the melting ice in the Arctic pave the way for new predatory activities with unexpected consequences?
Når vi nå har startet det endelige kappløpet inn I etter hvert isfritt Arktis, så det jo viktig å ha vår egen historie I bakhodet. Vil vi gjenta de feil med utryddelse, med uholdbar forvaltning av ressurser?
Eventually we're going to have to live without oil because it's a finite resource. We cannot live without food. And fish is probably the best human food available on the planet, certainly the best protein source available. Fish is a renewable resource. It's absolutely necessary to feeding the world population.
Looking to the future, there's a lot of challenges. It's like trying to turn around a big super tanker or something. It's, you know, the momentum is there, you know, to do things the way we've always done things, but we need to figure out ways to do things differently. I keep hoping that we are able to learn from the mistakes of the past.
Why would you develop a strategy which would, for very little extra gain, risk, because you don't know the outcome, there's no guarantees, but risk devastating some of the major fish stocks of the world? Why would you do that?
Det nok av historier I Arktis fra William Barents kom opp der første gang til hva vi har gjort med fiskeri på Newfoundland til andre historier på at ja, vi I stand til å ødelegge mye med enkle midler. Og når vi ser hva vi har av teknologi og midler, enten det høsting av ressurser eller atomubåter eller oljevirksomhet, så det klart, vi må være uhyre forsiktige. Fordi dette et økosystem som blir satt under stor belastning med temperaturforandringer de neste årene. Jeg optimist og tror jo at vi mennesker skal klare å forvalte dette, men det krever klokskap og aktsomhet av våre politiske ledere.
The world's final oil reserves are in the process of becoming depleted. Only one source remains untouched, the Arctic, the world's most northerly area, protected by a shield of ice and frost. Until now. Global warming and new technology are opening up access to these vast resources, but should the world's need for more fuel take precedence over the unique fauna and environment of the Arctic? Where should the borders be drawn? And is it possible to avoid conflict in the race for the Arctic? Oil has changed the world. We use it to fuel our vehicles and our war machinery. It runs our industry and our economy. And it's used as a raw material in numerous products. Our whole era has been defined by oil, but it's also a threat. As we approach the end of the oil age, we are still completely dependent on oil. Most of the world's major oil fields have now passed peak oil. The situation is most dramatic in the USA. This superpower will soon have no major oil wells left. The country is currently consuming 3 times as much oil as it produces, and it's paying sky-high prices throughout the world to secure access to this black gold. However, the USA still has well-stocked, untouched oil reserves in its own territory, in the sea off Alaska. The northernmost town in the USA, Barrow, lies in the middle of an area which is believed to contain Alaska's richest oil reserves. And the communities in this region have both the will and the political power to slow down the exploitation that might take place in their region. The The local Eskimo population lives mainly off the area's natural land and sea resources and an indomitable will to survive, and they're now directing their energy towards the oil industry that wants to establish activities in the area. One of these Eskimos is Eugene Brower Jr., who has placed himself at the forefront of the battle against the oil companies.
Based on my observation and dealings with the oil industry, they are not very much worried about the marine mammals or the people that are going to be impacted in the area. All they're looking at is their bottom line. Can they make millions and millions or billions on a major fund in the ocean? They're not looking at the consequences of the people that are being impacted by whatever's going to be happening out there.
Eskimo history and traditions in Alaska go back almost 3,000 years. They're linked directly to a unique style of hunting due to the fact that during the winter, the sea is covered by ice, which extends all the way to the North Pole. The Eskimo people have used the pack ice as a base for hunting bowhead whales, which can grow to lengths of up to 20 meters.
The whaling is the fabric of this town and a lot of the coastal villages that subsist the bowhead whale. It goes back thousands of years, and he holds everybody together. Everything evolves around the whale. Captain's greatest honor to feed the community of 4,000 or 5,000 people and sharing that great animal to the people that live around you.
Eugene Brower Jr. was 8 years old the first time he joined his father's team. He worked his way up through the ranks, and today he is also a captain. Now, during the spring, his whaling team sets up camp and lives on the ice for several weeks. This is the time when pods consisting of several thousand bowhead whales migrate east beneath the ice, heading towards Greenland. Patience is an invaluable virtue when the hunters wait for the whales to surface in cracks in the ice.
It's kind of like a bond that you have with the animal. And when he comes up, he'll come right to your boat, and sometimes he'll stop. Don't even move. You just make the strike where you need to make your instantaneous kill, and you have to roll over and die.
For the time being, the whalers have the ice-covered sea to themselves. But Brower knows that he's fighting a battle against a powerful opponent, an opponent waiting just 400 kilometers away. Prudhoe Bay is the largest oil field in the USA. Since oil was discovered here during the 1970s, more than 15 billion barrels of oil has been pumped up from the field, covering up to 20% of the USA's oil requirements. Large quantities of gas have also been found in this area.
The oil and gas industry in Alaska is the cornerstone of all of the industries here in the state of Alaska. Direct and indirect employment from oil and gas, approximates 44,000 employees. And so that makes up roughly 1 in every 8 jobs in the state of Alaska is directly related to the oil and gas industry being here, drilling wells, spending money. So it's very, very important to the state.
But after almost 40 years of operations, a dramatic situation has emerged. During peak production, Prudhoe Bay produced 2 million barrels of oil per day. Today, this figure has dropped to just a few 100,000 barrels per day. The fields are becoming depleted and no new finds are being made. The oil industry is therefore seeking to expand its exploration areas because there are still huge quantities of oil to be obtained from this area beneath the ice-covered ocean. A survey conducted in 2008 showed that probably only 1/3 of Alaska's reserves have been extracted. There are still 30 billion untouched barrels of oil right outside Barrow. The survey also showed that it's highly likely that there are major oil reserves around Canada and Greenland, off the Norwegian coast and on the Russian continental shelf. Total Arctic oil reserves are estimated at almost 90 billion barrels. There are people and indigenous populations living all over the Arctic who, for better or worse, would be affected if the petroleum industry descended on their territory. The industry would be able to provide jobs and tax revenue, but possibly at the expense of destroying their lifestyle and traditions. Arctic fauna would also be affected. Many species only live in this area, and their survival is completely dependent on the ice and the unspoilt wilderness. There would be a price to pay for establishing the oil and gas industry in the Arctic, and Alaska is more aware of this than anyone else.
The French, the Soviets, and the U.S. Navy are sending oil skimmers. Exxon officials promise they won't pull out until Prince William Sound looks like it did before the accident. Evidence of environmental damage continues to wash up on miles of beaches.
The sinking of the Exxon Valdez oil tanker in Alaska in 1989 is one of the worst disasters to have occurred in the history of the oil industry. Miles of beaches were ruined, and at least 250,000 seabirds died because of the oil. The natural landscape and economy of the area are still suffering from this disaster.
Exxon Valdez happened in pretty ideal conditions. We don't want to see anything like that happen because it will be virtually the end of our way of life.
Edward Itter, the mayor, basically has a positive attitude to onshore oil and gas activities in his county. However, now that the oil industry wants to start drilling in the sea, he's putting his foot down. Itter represents a population of just over 8,000 people, but even so, he wields tremendous power over the millions of people living in the USA.
The gas chiller building and the chiller.
Because in practice, it's his county council which is currently blocking offshore operations in Alaska, despite the USA's precarious oil requirements.
We are trying everything we can to get our message out. And it's not an extreme message. It's not the message some environmentalist and conservation groups are saying, not to drill, period. We're saying meet our concerns. Assure us that an oil spill can be cleaned up in our waters up here, especially in ice-infested waters.
And Itter has shown that he means business. In 2005, The Bush administration permitted the sale of offshore licenses in the territory outside Barrow. They ignored local objections about the polar bears and whales which live here being threatened species. The oil industry invested $2.7 billion on licenses and started carrying out seismic surveys. However, these exploration activities soon came to a halt because under the leadership of ITER, a number of lawsuits were filed against them. One court found in favor of ITER and the local population, stating that the environmental impact would first need to be investigated in greater detail.
What I am striving for as mayor of the North Slope Borough is to put our way of life, our subsistence way of life, on an equal footing with the needs of our country. We recognize very clearly the needs of our country. We recognize the benefits that we have received economically from the development of oil and gas onshore.
The camp has been set up several kilometers offshore. The ice appears to be stable, but Eugene Brower Jr. keeps a constant vigil. Out here, a change in the wind or an unexpected attack by a polar bear could mean the difference between life and death. The members of the team have been given orders to work quietly. The bowhead whale has extremely good hearing and is very sensitive to unusual sounds, even through the ice.
When the oil industry was doing seismic activity, we could not spot or see any whales 30, 40 miles offshore. Nothing. For the simple fact they put a floating platform about 20 miles to the east of us, 9 miles out in 60 feet of water. It was idling in idle mode, but the noise that was being emitted from that man-made drilling platform was diverting the whales out.
Whaling activities were completely ruined that year. Eugene had to cancel all his plans and travelled many kilometres across the ice to find whales. And even then, the Barrow whalers only caught 4 out of their quota of 22.
So by the time they struck and landed those 4 whales, the only thing that was eatable was the muktuk, that's the skin and the blubber. And the rest of the stuff that we'd like to eat, and they had bloated so we couldn't eat them.
From the point of view of the United States Capitol, this deadlocked conflict in Alaska is a cause for concern. For the politicians and experts here, there is more at stake than just the environment.
In the United States today, people are deeply concerned about climate change, and they're deeply concerned about polar bears and indigenous populations and so forth. And so people tend to be looking at the problem from the point of view of a feeling that there is an infinite amount of oil. And so we don't have to drill in sensitive areas. We don't have to do this. We don't have to do that. Renewables will solve all of our problems and so forth. And so people are not really facing up to the real issues that are involved.
For the first 100 years after oil was first discovered in the USA, the country was self-sufficient in oil. This was one of the reasons why the nation was able to develop to become a superpower. By the 1970s, the USA was experiencing the peak of national oil production. The country was pumping out almost 10 million barrels of oil per day in order to run the wheels of society. Since then, oil extraction has been reduced by 50% to around 5 million barrels, while consumption has increased to 15 million barrels. The USA now has to import 10 million barrels of oil every single day, putting the country in a very difficult position.
Of the top 9 oil exporters in the world, only democratic Norway is a liberal democracy. The others are all either autocratic kingdoms or dictatorships, or they may pretend to democracy such as Russia, but are in fact dictatorships. I think that there's no way the United States or North America could increase its production of oil from relatively expensive sources such as oil shale in the United States or oil sands in Alberta and Canada, and then build a protective barrier around North America and just consume what we produce.
James Woolsey was the director of the powerful US Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, during the 1990s. In his current role as an advisor, he's become a keen champion of environmental issues and believes that both serve the same goal.
Not destroy oil, but destroy its strategic role, destroy its monopoly, destroy its dominance of transportation. I think by moving toward electrification of transportation and toward alternative biofuels, second and third generation biofuels largely made from waste products, from agricultural residues, from algae, etc.
Dependence on oil is considered to be the main reason behind the US invasion of Kuwait and Iraq. Both of these countries are now some of the USA's most important suppliers of oil. But this nowhere near covers total US requirements. The USA is forced to engage in oil trading and to build alliances with a number of countries and regimes that are politically miles apart, including unstable nations like Venezuela and Nigeria. But the USA's most important oil supplier is Saudi Arabia, whose authoritarian royal family adheres to the militant extremist Wahhabi branch of Islam. In exchange for oil, the USA sells huge quantities of weapons to the Wahhabis.
In Wahhabi Islam, which if you read their fatwas, which is what one ought to read, not what they say to us, but what they say to one another in Arabic, translated. The Wahhabis of Saudi Arabia's views are murderous with respect to Shiite Muslims, Jews, homosexuals, and apostates, extraordinarily oppressive of women, and have as the objective a worldwide caliphate someday, a worldwide theocracy, a theocratic dictatorship. Those views are substantively the same as Al-Qaeda's. Al-Qaeda believes they should feel free to fly airplanes into buildings in New York and Washington or any place else, wherever they want, whenever they want. But the substantive views of the Wahhabis and Al-Qaeda are approximately the same. Because they are so rich. Saudis control about 90% of the world's Islamic institutions. Well, what that means is if a little Pakistani boy in Rawalpindi or a little Palestinian boy in Hebron is being taught in a school that he should, more than anything else, want to be a suicide bomber, the people who are paying for him to be educated, those little boys to be educated that way, are essentially you and me. Every time we pull into a filling station, every time we fill up with gasoline.
Well, clearly, the U.S. is not producing what it had in the past. Today, the United States is importing 65% of the crude oil that it uses. I can remember a time when folks got concerned when that number approached 20%, and clearly we're far beyond that. So in terms of what it means for the nation's energy security, the increased oil and gas production that could come from Alaska would go a long way to satisfying the needs of U.S. energy consumers.
It was therefore no surprise when oil exploration in Alaska became part of the U.S. election campaign in 2008, led by Alaska's own candidate for the vice presidency, Sarah Palin.
We cannot leave ourselves at the mercy of foreign suppliers. To confront the threat that Iran might seek to cut off nearly a fifth of the world's energy supplies, or that terrorists might strike again at the Abqaiq facility in Saudi Arabia, or that Venezuela might shut off its oil discoveries and its deliveries of that source, Americans, we need to produce more of our own oil and gas. And take it from a gal who knows the North Slope of Alaska, we've got lots of both.
How many drilling operations are going to be allowed? Is it 2, 4, 10, 15, 20? We don't know. Nobody will tell us. And in that light, we have what we call cumulative effects, because there are 3 or 4 major multinational, international oil companies that want to operate offshore. And by themselves, they don't make much of a difference, and so they're given the permit. But cumulatively, when you put all 3 or 4 together, then the noise, the support ships, the helicopter services, everything starts to add up, and pretty soon it seems that the value of oil and gas is brought way up, and the value of our way of life, the subsistence value, is diminished.
As far as the USA is concerned, oil is the most important resource in the Arctic. However, on the opposite side of the Arctic Ocean, another Arctic resource is playing a much greater role: gas. The survey, carried out in 2008, showed that total gas reserves in the Arctic probably amount to a massive 1.6 billion cubic feet. This alone is enough to supply the whole world for 15 years. Substantial quantities of this gas are thought to be located in Alaska, but the really big finds, over 2/3, are on the Russian continental shelf.
I think Russia will be in a very important strategic position. Of course, there's quite some distance to the Western markets, but they will have an energy resource that could be very useful for Western Europe for many, many decades to come. And I think we'll see some very important political discussions between Russia and the Western world about gas in the coming years.
Murmansk lies in the northwestern part of Russia, and it is the world's largest town north of the Arctic Circle. Murmansk experienced a severe decline when the Soviet Union collapsed. The naval base in the area was more or less closed down, and Murmansk, with its 370,000 inhabitants, entered a period of massive unemployment and poverty. However, today, the town is experiencing growth. The number of vehicles on the roads is on the increase. Roads, houses and new supermarkets are being built, and the port, which had been declining since the 1990s, is to undergo a complete makeover. The reason for this lies in the sea off Murmansk on the so-called Stockman field. The Stockman field is considered to be the most promising gas find in the Russian part of the Arctic, and it's to be developed under a joint venture with the Russian oil company Gazprom, French Total, and Norwegian Statoil Hydro.
There is good cooperation on the political level between Russia and Norway, and we are pleased to see that Putin has appointed Norway as Russia's strategic partner in the north. I regard Stockman as the locomotive for new offshore developments in the Arctic.
But the help being offered to Russia by the European oil industry is also giving cause for concern. When Stockman comes on stream in 2013, if all goes according to plan, the field will provide the whole of Europe with gas for 50 years to come. In many ways, Europe is in the same situation as the USA, producing little energy of its own when compared to its consumption. And in the West, there are many people who are skeptical about the power that this will give Russia.
We can remember that several years ago, Mr. Putin, he visited Germany and he asked Frau Merkel to sign the future agreement to sell all this gas from the second stage of Stockman to Germany, and she refused. After the pressure of France, after the pressure of Mr. Chirac, who was the president of France, he said that it's very dangerous, this cooperation between Russia and Germany, and he asked her not to do it. And Putin was very angry, but we see that now we have two possible partners, French Total and Norway Statoil Hydro. And of course, we know very well, it's not a secret, that without foreign companies, it will be very difficult to develop this project.
I think it's a very serious security situation for Europe. We have one problem, oil. Europe has two, oil and gas. The Russians will throw, under Putin and Medvedev, whatever, they will throw their weight around as much as they possibly can, because holding in reserve and only mentioning from time to time that they have a nuclear capability and they would threaten, say, Poland or the Czech Republic for cooperating with the United States. They've done this recently. But if they have their nuclear threat and then on a day-to-day basis they try to influence their near and not so near neighbors, all of Western Europe almost, with their energy-based power, that cuts down on their need for conventional armed forces. It's a dangerous situation.
The wind on the ice has become stronger, and Eugene Brouwer is not taking any chances. He's seen whalers lose both their boats and equipment when they've waited too long before retreating. In the past, such situations were rare, but in recent years, Eugene has noted that the ice has become thinner and thus weaker than previously. Strong winds cause the ice to give way more easily.
We're only about a mile from where the polar pack is grinding out there and making pressure ridges. So for the safety of my crew and my equipment, we have to pull out till this wind dies down, and as warm as the weather is, I don't trust it, and I'm going to pull back, pull my equipment back, and then wait for the more ideal conditions and come back out with my crew.
Eugene Brouwer is not the only one to notice that ice conditions have changed. A long time before the concept of global warming became known, indigenous populations throughout the Arctic were issuing warnings about less ice and higher temperatures in their territory. Everyone can see that they were right. Satellite pictures show how the area covered by ice has suffered dramatic reductions since 1979 and has been melting at an ever-increasing rate with each successive year. This increase is caused by sunlight shining on an ocean that is becoming increasingly ice-free and which absorbs heat from the sun, thus causing the ice to melt from below. Climate researchers estimate that by 2030, the Arctic will be completely ice-free during the summer. Polar bears, seals, walruses, and several species of birds and fish would then be facing extinction. There is broad agreement that carbon dioxide emissions from the burning of oil and gas is the main reason why the ice is melting. And there is a certain amount of irony in the fact that the oil companies are earning most on this melting ice.
In a way, it is a paradox that it is changes in climate that makes it possible to make oil and gas exploration and production in the Arctic. We can see that now, for instance, in Northwest Greenland and Northeast Greenland. We could not acquire seismic data 10, 15 years ago. It was very difficult. Now it's much easier. And with new data and new models, then of course you'll see more exploration. It's the same north of Alaska and north of Canada. These areas were locked by ice more or less year-round, and now you see a lot of open water.
Pressure on the Arctic will increase dramatically as the ice melts, because global oil requirements are expected to increase over the next few decades as the oil fields simultaneously become more depleted. The situation in India and China serves to illustrate this. Over 1/3 of the world's population, 2.4 billion people, live in these countries. At the same time, they've experienced annual economic growth amounting to almost 10% since the 1980s and 1990s. China currently imports around 4 million barrels of crude oil per day, while the equivalent figure for India is around 2 million. If growth continues at the same rate, both countries will overtake the United States in a few decades, both economically and in terms of oil consumption. If the demand for oil increases as dramatically as indicated by this scenario, the only possible solution would be to start searching for oil in new areas, because it would be impossible for today's oil fields to produce enough for everyone.
People need to recognize that peak oil is a reality. It's clearly been demonstrated in the United States and Norway and a number of other countries around the world. In fact, a few years ago, the Swedish Royal Academy did a study and concluded that 55 out of 65 of the world's largest oil-producing countries were past peak and in decline. And there are likely significant reserves of oil in areas that are now off limits, and companies are not able to go in and produce that oil. At some point, that's likely to change because people will be desperate for oil.
The oil industry is already busy making preparations for the expansion of operations in the Arctic. However, warnings issued by environmentalists and opposition from local populations have had some impact. During the spring of 2009, a unique research project was carried out in the icy waters off the Svalbard island of Hulpin. The expedition was funded by 6 oil companies under the leadership of the Norwegian SINTEF Research Institute. The main objective was to investigate ways in which efficient cleanup operations could be conducted in the event of an oil spill in Arctic waters.
In open water, the main challenge is the waves and the currents and how the boom behaves in these conditions. In ice, we have other challenges like low temperatures. We also have darkness in the winter, which is challenging. So we have different problems in ice compared to open water, but we also have different solutions.
During full-scale trials, 20 cubic meters of oil was released. Afterwards, different methods such as mechanical collection and the use of chemicals were tested. One of the first observations made was that the ice actually helped the cleanup operations. This surprised the scientists, since they had always thought that ice hampered cleanup work.
The ice is keeping the oil confined, and it prevents the oil from spreading. It also dampens the sea, so we don't have the same wave problems as we have in open water. If the oil is in between these ice flows, it will follow the same speed as the ice flows. Meaning that it will not spread very fast, and it will not drift very fast. So the oil can be collected in between the ice flows.
The most efficient method of oil clearance is to ignite an oil slick, causing 95% of the oil to burn up. This method is rarely used in warmer climates because oil combines with water after just a few hours. The scientists on Hulpen showed that in icy waters, oil takes much longer to mix with water. The oil was ignitable for up to 5 days after being released. This could mean that rescue teams would have more time to come to the rescue. But these methods obviously have their limitations. They would be dependent on having the right equipment and actually getting personnel to the location of an oil slick, something that couldn't be guaranteed in the Arctic. Furthermore, the weather conditions and proximity to vulnerable areas would also limit the type of cleanup alternatives that could be used. Oil and gas operations in the Arctic will never be entirely without risk. Thanks to a number of United Nations reports and climate conferences, the world has become more aware than ever before of the serious environmental situation. Research is being carried out into new sources of energy, such as solar energy, HEP and wind power. Vehicles are being developed that can run on emission-free sources of energy. And some countries have already set ambitious emission targets without waiting for international agreements. South Korea is almost completely dependent on foreign energy imports. Here, they are now making a full commitment towards producing their own CO2-free energy in a manner which, paradoxically, was recently regarded as being the most environmentally hostile of all.
We have to calculate the cost and benefit, and I think developing nuclear energy resources will be better than continuing to depend on coals or oils, which produces huge amounts of CO2s. So I think for the time being, we may focus on nuclear energy, but we will have to continue our efforts on developing solar energies, for example.
그래서 그런 면에서 작년에 화석연료에 대한 의존이 82%가 화석연료에 의존해서 에너지를 쓰고 있었습니다만 2030년에는 이를 82%에서 61%로 대폭 의존도를 낮추고 그 대신 그 공백을 그 갭을 신재생 에너지 또 원자력과 같은 청정 에너지로 청정 에너지를 보강해서 에너지 믹스를 이뤄 나가겠다 그런 말씀을 드릴 수 있겠습니다.
Skeptics claim that with nuclear power we would be getting rid of one problem and replacing it with another. A number of leading nations are planning to follow the example of South Korea, and by 2020 it's anticipated that almost 1/5 of the world's energy will be derived from nuclear power. This is the price we'll have to pay if we want to get rid of oil.
I've proposed an investment of $15 billion a year, $150 billion all told, over 10 years in alternative energy, which will create millions of jobs and break the cycle of our addiction to oil. We need to do more than drill.
The question is one of whether or not investing in new sources of energy would come in time to avert global depletion of oil, something which would impact heavily on local populations and the unique fauna of the Arctic. As the end of the oil era approaches, there are no sources of energy that are ready to replace the dominant role played by oil in our society. And anyone standing in the way of the world's last untouched oil reserves would be subjected to ever-increasing pressure.
We've been blessed with enormous amounts of oil for a long period of time, and it's led to, I think, wonderful development of civilization in the world. Of course, we got problems, and we've done a number of things we wish we could redo, but we're really very, very fortunate for what we've had. But that's going to go away, and we're going to have to deal with the problem realistically as opposed to idealistically. In terms of how people ought to think about this is, number one, recognize that it's going to happen. Number two, recognize that it's going to have terrible economic consequences for most people in the world, and recognize that fixing the problem is not going to happen quickly.
I believe in my heart of hearts that eventually there will be oil and gas development offshore. The energy needs of America are too great. And be that as it may,
The wind has died down and open sea can be glimpsed in the distance. This is the chance Eugene Brower has been waiting for.
A lot of adrenaline flowing in you when you get the harpoon. Because that darting gun, when it's fully rigged, is about maybe 20 pounds, 20 to 25 pounds, depending on the diameter of the handle. So the harpooner has to have the strength to pick it up and throw it at the whale. The whale can be about maybe 6 meters away from you. It's an honor, and nothing like it. We have a belief that whale gives himself to you. If you deem worthy that he'll come to you and let you strike it. You kill it and you bring it home, and it's the honor that you have. The people rejoice by hollering, hugging, crying, that they have fresh animal to eat. Then we pray. We give thanks to the maker of the great animal to give us this whale for us to feed our community with. My main hope with all the fights of the oil industry is that my people will live the lifestyle that we are living right now. The world is changing, but the marine resources is something that I want to keep and have. Our people are evolved around sharing. You share what you have. You share your catch. You give to the less fortunate. The animal will always come back to you and give itself to you, so you can always keep that going. And that's a lifestyle I want my children to have and enjoy in their lifetime.